Okay, so initially we have demand curve D and supply curve S, while equilibrium takes place at E, price is P and quantity is Q. Whenever government imposes indirect tax, it shifts supply curve to the left. So the new supply curve is S1 and new equilibrium takes place at E1, and the new equilibrium price that consumers will pay is P1. And if we draw perpendicular, we will get another quantity that is Q1, which is lesser than earlier. And we also we can find a vertical gap between two supply curves from E1 to A, let's assume. And at at basically point A, we can find another price that is P2. And this vertical gap between two supply curves S1 and S that is shown with E1 and A, this vertical gap shows per unit tax, and the total quantity is Q1, OQ1. If we multiply height and base, we will get total tax from P1 to P2 and then to A and E1 and then P1. So this is the total amount of tax. So per unit tax in this graph is per unit tax is equal to E1A, or it is equal to P1 P2. So keep in mind this vertical gap from P1 to P2 is exactly same as E1 and A. So it represents per unit tax. So the total amount of tax here is total tax is equal to P1, P2, A and E1, right? Out of which some part of the tax is paid by the consumers and some part of the tax is paid by the producers, right? So if we look into the division, then we had initial price P. So after tax price equilibrium price increased from P to P1, that has resulted in burden on the consumer equal to this area. We can also label this point as B, for example, this is point B. Okay, so tax burden on consumer is tax burden on the consumer is equal to P, P1, E1 and B. So this shaded area is tax burden on the consumer. Okay. Out of total tax, the remaining part will be paid by the producer. So this area represents the tax burden on producer. So now we can write down tax burden on producer as well. Tax burden on the producer. That is equal to P, P2, A and B. So this area that I'm shading right now is tax burden on the producer. So this is how you can find out tax burden, and we can now consider a numerical example as well. यहाँ पे मैंने आपको like alphabets में यहाँ show किए, लेकिन अगर हम इसकी numerical example ले लें तो that will look like this. So for example, ये जैसे मैंने alphabets में इसको लिखा था, अब मैं अगर इस पे numbers plot कर देता हूँ तो किस तरह से हम find करेंगे. So this is quantity, this is demand curve, this is supply curve. Equilibrium takes place at E, and equilibrium price is, let's assume it's $10, right? So on Y we have price, and this is an initial quantity which is, let's say, 100 units. Now if government imposes an indirect tax, then supply will shift to the left and the new supply curve will be S1, and new equilibrium will take place at E1, and equilibrium quantity will be Q1. And let's assume this new quantity is, for example, 80 units, and this price is, let's say, $15, and this vertical gap between two supply curves is per unit tax from E1 to A. This is per unit tax. So what will be the total tax then if we multiply per unit tax with quantity, that is 80, then we will find the total rectangular area, and the new price that producers will receive is, let's assume it's $8. So what will be the total amount of tax? As I told you earlier that this perpendicular between two supply curves E1 to A is per unit tax. You can also see this gap from 15 to 8, तो ये आपके पास per unit tax आ जाएगा. Per unit tax. Per unit tax कितना है? How much is that? 8 से 15 तक का जो गैप है ये कितना बन रहा है? $7 का गैप बन रहा है. So $7 is per unit tax. So what will be the total tax then? Total tax के लिए हम क्या करेंगे? Per unit tax multiply by quantity कर देंगे. Quantity हमारे पास कितनी है? 80 है. This is the quantity. So 80 into 7 करें तो कितना होगा? 560. Okay, Zara. 560. And out of this 560, this is the total amount of tax. Out of this 560, this area will be paid by the consumer and this area will be paid by the producer. So how much is the burden on consumer? Tax burden on consumer is equal to, देखिए this area is burden on the consumer, this area. So you can just find out this the area basically of consumer burden. For that you have to basically multiply height and base. Height is like 5. From 10 to 15 it's 5, and base is 80, that is quantity basically, and 8 into 5 is equal to 40, so it will be total 400, and rest of the tax burden will be on the producer. And how much is that? That will be burden on producer. Burden on producer is equal to ये कितना एरिया बनता है? अगेन इसको भी हम is equal to फाइंड कर लेंगे. Now this is height and this is base, right? So height is now 2 and base is 80. So 80 into 2 is equal to 160. So out of 560, 400 tax will be paid by the consumers and 160 will be paid by the producers, and collectively 400 plus 160 makes 560. ठीक है? So this is the division of indirect tax between consumers and producers. Okay. So अब हम देख लेते हैं लाइक सब्सिडी किस तरह से फाइंड करते हैं और सब्सिडी का रिलीफ किस तरह से फाइंड होता है. सो सब्सिडी इज ऑपोजिट टू द इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स, और सब्सिडी इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स की वजह से सप्लाई कम हो जाती है, डिक्रीजेस एंड शिफ्ट्स टू द लेफ्ट, and the provision of subsidy will shift supply curve to the right, because subsidy is a relief to the producers and consumers, and if government provides subsidy then producers will be able to produce and supply more, so as a result supply curve will move to the right. So again we have to label the graph perfectly. We have quantity on x and we have price on y. So again draw the demand curve that is negatively sloped and draw a supply curve that is positively sloped, and the intersection point of demand and supply is E, where equilibrium price is let's say it's $10 and equilibrium quantity is, let's assume, 100 units. Now the provision of subsidy will shift supply curve to the right from S to S1, and as a result equilibrium will move to E1, and now the equilibrium quantity has increased. Let's assume the new quantity is 150 for example, and the new price that consumers will pay is, let's assume, $8. So consumers were initially paying $10, now they are paying $8. So this is relief for the consumer. So consumers were paying high price initially, now they are paying low price because of subsidy. So this is the relief for the consumers. Sorry, this is relief for the consumers. And again, for finding per unit subsidy, we have to extend the perpendicular from the new quantity to the initial supply curve from point E1 to A, and this is the price that producers will get in the market. Let's assume it's $14, right? So we can now find out, like, first of all, we can find out per unit subsidy. Per unit subsidy is the amount of subsidy on each unit that is produced and supplied by the producer. So that is the vertical gap from 14 to 8, or A to E1. This vertical gap represents per unit subsidy. So per unit subsidy will be 14 minus 8, that is equal to $6. And how much subsidy will be given to the producer and how much to the consumer? So we have already figured out the amount of subsidy paid to the consumers. This is basically relief to the consumer. And how much is that? For that, we need to find out the area of this rectangle, right? So the area of rectangle is calculated by multiplying height and base. So subsidy or relief of subsidy to the consumer, is equal to 2 into the new quantity is 150, 2 into 150, and that will be like $300. And subsidy to the producers is this much. Initially, producers were getting lower price, that is $10. Now they are getting $14. So government is also giving them extra relief, right? So subsidy to the producer. Okay, Hassan. Give me a few seconds. I'll explain you that once again. Subsidy to the producer. Subsidy to the producer is again this much, the area that I'm sharing right now. और ये कितना बनता है, like height into base करेंगे तो height is 14 from height is 4 from 10 to 14, and base is 150, right? This is the base. So if we multiply them, then 5 fours are 20, 4 ones are 4, 5 6 600. So this is the amount of subsidy that is received by the producers. And what should be the total subsidy then? Definitely, if we add 300 and 600, we will get total subsidy. Total subsidy is equal to 300 plus 600, that is equal to 900. So, but how to calculate this, the area of 900? So, total amount of subsidy is shown with the complete rectangle, this area that I'm labeling right now. This is the total subsidy. So what you can do is you can just find out the area of this rectangle, right? So height of this rectangle is from like 8 to 14, that is $7, and the base is 150. So for finding the amount of rectangle, what we do is we multiply base and perpendicular. So perpendicular is 7, base is 150, and when we multiply them, we will get $900 total amount of subsidy. ओके, सो यहाँ पे एक छोटी सी चीज़ है जो बच्चों को बहुत कंफ्यूज करती है कि पर यूनिट सब्सिडी या पर यूनिट टैक्स हम कैसे फाइंड करते हैं. ठीक है, सो इफ़ वी मूव बैक टू आवर प्रीवियस ग्राफ, जैसे यहाँ पे मैंने बनाया हुआ है, इसके लिए मैं एक सिंपल सी आपको ये जो जैसे मैंने बताया कि दिस वर्टिकल गैप इज पर यूनिट सब्सिडी, पर यूनिट टैक्स. इस केस में ये पर यूनिट टैक्स है. जब हम टैक्स लगाते हैं सप्लाई लेफ्ट हो जाता है. और जब वर्टिकल गैप आप यहाँ से न्यू क्वांटिटी से इधर फाइंड करते हैं, दिस इज पर यूनिट सब्सिडी। ठीक है, सो राइट नाउ आई एम फोकसिंग ऑन पर यूनिट टैक्स। तो वही जो पर यूनिट सब्सिडी होती है, पर यूनिट टैक्स भी वही एग्जैक्टली वही चीज़ होती है। लेकिन अब क्वेश्चन में भी आपके जहन में ये राइज हो रहा हो कि वर्टिकल गैप ही क्यों पर यूनिट सब्सिडी है, इसको हम देख लेते हैं। देखें, अगर हम अज्यूम करते हैं कि कुछ वैल्यूज हम अज्यूम कर लेते हैं, वी अज्यूम के हम एक ही बस वैल्यू ले लेते हैं, लेट्स से कि इनिशियली जो प्राइस है बिफोर टैक्स जो थी, प्राइस बिफोर टैक्स, जो गवर्नमेंट ने टैक्स नहीं लगाया था, तब प्राइस लेट्स से $10 थी, एंड क्वांटिटी सप्लाइड वाज लेट्स अज्यूम 100 यूनिट्स। अब गवर्नमेंट ने क्या किया, टैक्स लगा दिया, लेट्स अज्यूम $2 का टैक्स लगा दिया। सो प्राइस आफ्टर टैक्स फिर क्या हो जाएगी, प्राइस आफ्टर टैक्स, जी कोई बच्चा बता सकता है प्राइस आफ्टर टैक्स क्या होगी अगर $2 का गवर्नमेंट टैक्स लगा दिए तो? जी 12 हो जाएगी, बिल्कुल सही। सो प्राइस आफ्टर टैक्स 12 हो जाएगी। अब अगर हम इसी चीज़ को लाइक सप्लाई कर्व पे जब प्लॉट करेंगे, लेट्स अज्यूम कि इनिशियली सप्लाई कर्व हमारे पास ये था, इन इनिशियल we have quantity on x and this is initial supply curve, and we have price on y, and we have quantity equals to 100 units, and at quantity 100 initially price is $10, right? This is $10। अब क्या हुआ, अब गवर्नमेंट ने लगा दिया टैक्स, $2 का टैक्स लगाया, तो सेम क्वांटिटी के लिए अब प्राइस जो है हमारी $12 हो गई। सो अब हमें क्या करना होगा, इसी सेम क्वांटिटी के लिए थोड़ा सा ऊपर जाना होगा ताकि हमें एक न्यू प्राइस $12 मिल जाए। सो दिस इज द न्यू प्राइस आफ्टर द imposition ऑफ टैक्स। इट मीन्स द न्यू supply curve will cross from this point, so the new supply curve is this one। So at this quantity we found a vertical gap between two supply curves, and this vertical gap is equal to the $2 that is per unit tax। ठीक है, पर यूनिट टैक्स, पर यूनिट टैक्स। जी मेरी आवाज़ पे ज़्यादा फोकस करें राइटिंग की बजाय। सो टोटल टैक्स, देन व्हाट विल बी द टोटल टैक्स हियर इन दिस केस, टोटल टैक्स विल बी, total tax is equal to 2 into 100 is equal to $200। so total tax 200 होगा, और पर यूनिट टैक्स जो है वो हमारे पास $2 पर यूनिट होगा। जी अच्छा, इसकी कोई कंफ्यूजन है तो बताएं आप लोग मुझे, चैट में लिख के बताएं मुझे अगर इसकी कंफ्यूजन है तो। जी बेटा, सारे लोग प्लीज़ रिप्लाई करें, कुछ लोगों ने रिप्लाई दिया बट, जी ओके ठीक है बेटा। सो अभी मैंने जैसे समझाया था कि जो दो सप्लाई का उसका वर्टिकल गैप होता है ना, ये वाला, दिस रिप्रेजेंट्स पर यूनिट टैक्स। क्यों होता है, क्योंकि टैक्स लगने से पहले अगर ये प्राइस थी, टैक्स लगने के बाद ये प्राइस है, तो दिस इज द per unit tax vertical gap W/T। So W/T is the correct answer for this question, vertical gap। अगर examiner, if examiner asks the total amount of tax, so this complete box will be the total tax, out of which consumers will pay this much and producers will pay this much। Okay, so I'm showing another question. This is like for subsidy. Just try this question, question number 2। Okay, Vita, so I can explain you this question if you are struggling with this। Okay, so again, like I told you earlier that the vertical gap between two supply curves is per unit subsidy and per unit tax, right? So in case of, this is the case of subsidy, right? So when government removes tax, then it is exactly same as subsidy. So it will shift supply curve to the right. And when supply curve shifts to the right, the new equilibrium price will be set at When supply curve shifts to the right from S to S1, new equilibrium will take place at E. And you can see the new equilibrium price is $6, right? So examiner is asking about price after removal of tax. So when government there was like imposition of tax, then price was at this point $8. After removal of tax, new price is $6. So after removal of tax, new price is $6. So you can pick these two values and cross the other options. So I can cross these two options. And what should be the per unit tax, right? So per unit tax or per unit subsidy is the vertical gap between two supply curves. So this vertical gap is per unit subsidy, and this vertical gap is also equal to this gap from 12 to 6. So the gap between 12 and 6, 12 minus 6 is equal to 6. So per unit tax is also 6. So option A is the correct answer. Okay बेटा ठीक है. So अगर किसी को समझ नहीं है तो I'll share this video with you after the class, so आप इसको फिर से एक दफ़ा देख सकते हैं. So बस ये एक क्वेश्चन और देख लें, फिर मैं आपको नेक्स्ट टॉपिक जो है वो थोड़ा समझाता हूँ. क्वेश्चन नंबर 4 देख लें प्लीज़. क्वेश्चन नंबर 4. Okay बेटा, so let me explain you this question as well. और यहाँ पे एग्जामिनर जो है ही इज सेइंग के आपके पास सप्लाई का दो हैं. एक सप्लाई ये है क्वांटिटी सप्लाई बिफोर टैक्स एंड आफ्टर टैक्स, बट क्वांटिटी डिमांड इज कॉमन इन बोथ केसेस. So first of all, what you can do is you can like find out the equilibrium between initial quantity demand and initial quantity supplied, right? Okay, okay, beta. So let me verify this. So what is the initial equilibrium point, right? Equilibrium, as we know, okay, equilibrium takes place where quantity demand is equal to quantity supplied. Okay, sir. So initially quantity demand and quantity supplied are equal at this point, right? So quantity demand is 340, quantity supplied is also 340, and at this equilibrium position, price is $16. Okay, so when like government imposes indirect tax, as we have seen earlier, that supply curve will shift. So now this supply curve becomes irrelevant. The new supply curve will be this one. So now again you have to find out the equilibrium position. Equilibrium position is where quantity demand is equal to quantity supply. So again quantity supply is 340 here and quantity demand is also 340 here. And now the new equilibrium price is 19. So the new equilibrium price will be $19. If equilibrium price before tax was 16, after tax it is 19, it means government has imposed tax of $3. So $3 will be the per unit tax.